Hey guys, tonight we begin with something cozy. Not cozy in a warm blanket and hot tea way, more like a giant globe-spanning bureaucracy powered by tea, ships, and an astonishing amount of confidence. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe put your phone face down, let your brain slowly untangle from the day. Because tonight, we're floating gently into the darker corners of the British Empire, the empire where the sun never set, which sounds poetic, inspiring even. But when you think about it, that just means it was always daytime somewhere, and that is exhausting. The British Empire did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, like mold, quietly, patiently, with a kind of damp enthusiasm. At its height in the early 20th century, it controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. 1 in 4 humans technically answered to London, which is ambitious, bold, slightly alarming. But let's not rush. We'll take this slow. It begins, as many questionable global ventures do, with ships, small wooden ships packed with men who looked at maps and thought, what if this was ours? Because why not? The 16th and 17th centuries were the golden age of European exploration, which is a polite way of saying arriving somewhere and declaring it yours. And of course, England wasn't going to sit quietly while Spain and Portugal hoarded continents like they were limited edition collectibles. That would be embarrassing. So, England joined the party. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia. A modest beginning, a group of settlers trying to survive, argue, and occasionally plant things. It didn't start out as a grand master plan for global domination. It was more like a corporate gamble. The Virginia Company was basically an early startup, except instead of an app, they were selling land they didn't technically own. And this sets the tone. The British Empire was, at heart, a business venture, a very large, very determined business venture. Let's gently drift east for a moment, to India. Ah, India, jewel in the crown. The phrase alone sounds glamorous, sparkling, regal, like something you'd keep in a velvet box. But before it was the crown jewel of an empire, it was home to vast, complex civilizations, thriving economies, and empires of its own. The Mughal Empire, for instance, was not exactly struggling before the British arrived. It was wealthy, sophisticated, architecturally ambitious, Taj Mahal levels of ambitious. Then along came the East India Company. Now, if there has ever been a corporate entity with main character energy, it was the East India Company. Founded in 1600, it began as a trading company, just spices, textiles, tea, innocent enough, a bit of commerce, a polite handshake. But over time, it developed its own army, which is usually a sign that things are about to get weird. By the 18th century, the East India Company wasn't just trading in India, it was running parts of it, collecting taxes, making laws, occasionally overthrowing local rulers, standard corporate activities. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was a turning point. Robert Clive, a man with the emotional stability of someone who probably needed a long vacation, managed to secure British dominance in Bengal through military force and a bit of strategic bribery, because nothing says legitimate governance like a well-timed payoff. And from there, control expanded. Taxes were raised, resources were extracted, local industries were reshaped to suit British markets. Indian textiles, once world famous, faced heavy restrictions. British manufactured goods flowed in. Local weavers struggled. It was efficient, profitable, deeply unfair. And yet, back in Britain, this was framed as progress, civilizing mission, development. Railways were built, which is true, railways were built, but they were primarily designed to move goods quickly to ports, because empire runs on logistics. Let's float gently to Ireland for a moment, closer to home, because the dark side of the British Empire wasn't only overseas. Ireland had been under English influence for centuries. Tensions were old, complicated, layered like an overcooked lasagna of political resentment. Then came the Great Famine in the late 1840s. A potato blight devastated crops, and potatoes were not just a side dish in Ireland, they were survival. When they failed, millions faced starvation. Food was still being exported from Ireland to Britain during the famine. That's one of those quiet historical details that just sits there, heavy, uncomfortable. The British government's response was slow, bureaucratic, deeply tied to free market ideology, because heaven forbid the invisible hand of the market get interrupted. About 1 million people died, another million emigrated. And this wasn't some distant colony, this was right next door. Let's drift back across the Atlantic. North America became another central piece of the imperial puzzle. 13 colonies, thriving, expanding, increasingly opinionated. They were fine with British protection, less fine with British taxes. The American Revolution is often told as a plucky underdog story, and sure, there's drama there. But from the imperial perspective, it was more like, wait, you're leaving after everything we've taxed you for? Losing America was embarrassing, but it didn't end the empire, it just redirected it. Canada remained, the Caribbean remained, and the Caribbean in particular was central to Britain's wealth. Sugar plantations were wildly profitable and brutally dependent on enslaved labor. Britain became one of the largest participants in the transatlantic slave trade. Ships transported millions of Africans across the ocean under horrific conditions. The triangular trade system, manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar and tobacco to Europe, was economically brilliant in the way only something morally catastrophic can be. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, which sounds progressive until you learn that slave owners were compensated financially for their loss of property. The formerly enslaved received nothing. It's one of those details that history textbooks sometimes whisper. Let's ease over to Africa now, late 19th century, the scramble for Africa, which sounds almost playful, like a game. It was not a game. European powers gathered in Berlin in 1885 to 1886 and essentially drew lines across the African continent with rulers on maps in rooms far away from the people who actually lived there. Britain acquired vast territories: Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. And with these came systems of extraction. Resources flowed outward: gold, diamonds, rubber, labor. In Kenya, land was appropriated for British settlers, local populations displaced. In South Africa, policies laid groundwork for racial segregation long before apartheid became official. And through it all, there was a consistent narrative: the civilizing mission, the idea that British rule brought order, law, and enlightenment. It's remarkable how flexible the human mind can be when profit is involved. Now let's gently settle on one more story before we close for tonight. China. Specifically, tea, because of course, tea is involved. Britain developed an intense love affair with tea, a national obsession, cups upon cups per day. But China didn't particularly want British goods in exchange. This created a trade imbalance, and Britain, being Britain, found a solution: opium. The British began exporting opium from India into China. Addiction spread, social consequences mounted. The Chinese government attempted to crack down. Britain responded with war. The Opium Wars in the mid-19th century resulted in China being forced to open ports to British trade and cede Hong Kong. It's one of those chapters where economic interests casually reshape geopolitics. And through all of this, back in London, the empire was a source of pride. Exhibitions displayed exotic goods and even people from colonies. Maps glowed red with imperial dominance. School children learned about glory, adventure, naval supremacy. It felt unstoppable. But empires, like people who drink too much tea, eventually start to tremble. The 20th century, we bring wars, nationalist movements, economic strain, colonies pushing back, independence movements gaining strength, the narrative of benevolent rule growing harder to maintain. But for now, just let your mind drift across oceans and centuries, wooden ships creaking in the dark, clerks in London tallying profits by candlelight, governors drafting policies in humid colonial offices, farmers in Bengal calculating taxes they cannot afford, families in Ireland staring at empty fields. An empire built on trade, on ambition, on naval power, on bureaucracy, on belief in its own righteousness. It was vast, it was organized, it was efficient, and it left marks, deep ones.
All right, settle back in. Maybe you've shifted sides. Maybe the blanket is now slightly too warm, but you refuse to move it because comfort is a delicate negotiation. Good. Perfect historical listening posture. Last time, we drifted across oceans and trade routes. Tonight, we're going to hover quietly behind desks, polished mahogany desks covered in maps, ink bottles, and very confident men who believed the world could be improved with straight lines and official stamps. Because empires are not just built by soldiers, they're built by administrators. Let's begin with one of the most famous imperial micromanagers of them all, Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon arrived in India in 1899 as viceroy. He was young, intensely self-assured, and radiating the kind of energy you get from someone who has never once doubted their own brilliance. He believed deeply in empire. Not casually, not for profit alone. He believed Britain had a destiny, a moral responsibility, a sort of global homework assignment from history itself. And to be fair, he worked very hard. Curzon toured extensively, he studied irrigation systems, he obsessed over frontier policy, he reorganized universities, he took governance extremely seriously. But there was a problem. He also believed Indians were fundamentally unfit to govern themselves, which does complicate the whole "we're here to help" narrative. In 1905, Curzon made one of his most infamous decisions, the partition of Bengal. Officially, it was administrative. Bengal was large, overcrowded, difficult to manage, so naturally, divide it. Unofficially, many Indians saw it as a deliberate attempt to divide Hindus and Muslims, a classic strategy. If people are arguing with each other, they're less likely to argue with you. Protests erupted, boycotts of British goods began, the Swadeshi movement encouraged local industry. What Curzon framed as tidy governance felt to millions like manipulation. And here's the thing about imperial administrators. They often believed their own justifications. Curzon genuinely saw himself as enlightened. He restored monuments, protected the Taj Mahal. He liked beauty. He liked order. But he could not quite imagine stepping aside. Eventually, political pressure forced the British to reverse the Bengal partition in 1911. Curzon had already left by then, but the resentment lingered. Let's float now to another architect of empire, a man whose name sounds almost gentle, Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was not a viceroy. He was something more modern, a businessman, a mining magnate, a politician, a firm believer that British rule was not just beneficial, but biologically superior. He made his fortune in diamonds in South Africa through De Beers. Yes, that De Beers. The sparkle industry has deep roots. Rhodes dreamed of a British-controlled corridor stretching from Cairo to Cape Town, a red stripe down Africa. On maps, it looked elegant, clean, almost artistic. On the ground, it meant conquest, land seizure, and policies that systematically disenfranchised Black Africans. In southern Africa, British settlers acquired vast tracts of land. Indigenous communities were pushed into reserves. Political rights were restricted along racial lines. These systems didn't vanish after Rhodes. They hardened. They evolved. Rhodes himself once said that being born English was like winning the lottery of life, which is a bold thing to announce. He saw empire not as exploitation, but as destiny. He also left behind scholarships. The Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, a prestigious academic award. It's one of those strange historical contradictions. A man whose policies deepened racial hierarchies also funded educational opportunity. History loves a paradox. Now let's drift gently toward Egypt. By the late 19th century, Britain had developed a strong interest in the Suez Canal, because if you control the canal, you control a shortcut to India. And if you control the shortcut to India, you control a lot of tea. In 1882, British forces occupied Egypt. Officially, it was temporary, just stabilizing the region, a quick intervention, in and out. They stayed until 1956. That's quite a long, quick intervention. British administrators restructured Egyptian finances, oversaw infrastructure, maintained ultimate authority behind a local facade. It was governance at arm's length, enough visibility to control outcomes, enough distance to claim it wasn't direct rule. Egyptians, understandably, developed opinions about this. Nationalist movements grew. Demands for independence intensified after World War I. Britain granted nominal independence in 1922, but kept significant control over defense and foreign policy. It was independence with an asterisk. Let's ease over to Kenya now. Early 20th century. British settlers established farms in fertile highland areas. Land that had long been used by local communities was reclassified, owned, allocated. The Kikuyu people, among others, were displaced. Colonial authorities implemented labor policies that effectively compelled Africans to work on settler farms, through taxes, through regulations, through limited alternatives. All of this was framed as modernization. Railways were built, towns expanded, coffee flourished. But beneath the tidy reports sent back to London, resentment simmered. By the 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising erupted, a complex, violent conflict rooted in land grievances and political exclusion. British response included detention camps, harsh counterinsurgency tactics, thousands detained, many abused. For decades, this chapter was minimized in official narratives, paperwork quietly archived, stories softened. Empires are very good at filing things away. Now let's slow down and look at something subtler: education. Across the empire, British authorities often established schools, teaching English, British history, British values. On the surface, this looked benevolent. Literacy expanded, administrative skills developed, but education also became a tool of cultural reshaping. Local traditions were often sidelined, indigenous languages discouraged. Students were taught about Magna Carta and Trafalgar long before their own histories. The message was gentle, persistent. Britain knows best. And here's where it gets complicated. Many future independence leaders were educated in British systems. They learned the language, the legal frameworks, the philosophical arguments about liberty and rights. And then they used those arguments against empire. Because once you teach someone about freedom, they may eventually ask for freedom. Across India, Africa, the Caribbean, nationalist movements grew stronger in the 20th century. Leaders organized, protested, negotiated. Britain, exhausted by 2 world wars, faced economic strain. Maintaining far-flung colonies grew expensive. Public opinion shifted. India gained independence in 1947, but even that transition was messy. Partition created India and Pakistan. Massive migrations followed. Communal violence erupted. Up to 1 million people died. British officials hurried the process. Lines were drawn quickly, decisions made under pressure, and once again, maps reshaped lives. Across Africa, independence movements accelerated in the 1950s and 60s, Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. Each transition carried its own tensions, some peaceful, some turbulent. Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It receded, gradually, like a tide going out. But the shore it left behind was changed. Borders created during colonial rule remained. Economic structures built around resource extraction persisted. Social hierarchies shaped by imperial policy did not simply dissolve. And back in Britain, the imperial identity had to adjust. For generations, empire had been a point of pride, a symbol of power, of global relevance. As colonies gained independence, Britain redefined itself. The Commonwealth emerged, diplomatic relations shifted, but history doesn't evaporate. Statues still stand, streets still bear names like roads, debates continue about memory, about accountability, about legacy. And here's the quiet truth. Many of the men who ran the empire believed they were doing good. They wrote letters home describing sunsets and infrastructure projects. They hosted dinners, filed reports, managed budgets. They rarely described themselves as oppressors. They saw themselves as caretakers of order, which is perhaps what makes the darker side of empire so unsettling. It wasn't always dramatic villainy. It was policy, procedure, paperwork. It was believing that someone else's land, labor, and future could be rearranged for the greater good. So, as you sink a little deeper into your pillow tonight, imagine those maps again, those straight lines across continents, those signatures at the bottom.
All right, we've arrived at the final stretch. You've made it through ships, trade monopolies, diamond barons, and men with maps who really trusted straight lines. So tonight, we let the empire exhale, slowly, a bit awkwardly, like someone realizing they've hosted a party that went on for 200 years too long. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire was still vast on paper, but the paper was getting thin. 2 world wars had drained Britain financially and psychologically. Maintaining far-flung colonies was expensive. Very expensive. Troops, infrastructure, administration, shipping lanes. And after 1945, the world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers. Anti-colonial movements were not fringe anymore. They were organized, educated, loud. And many of them had learned their rhetoric from Britain itself. Let's float gently back to India for a moment, because that's where the dominoes really began to fall. By the 1940s, the independence movement was unstoppable. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi had turned non-violent resistance into a moral spectacle the empire struggled to counter. Civil disobedience, salt marches, boycotts, calm, persistent refusal. And then there was Jawaharlal Nehru, articulate and Western-educated, speaking the language of democracy back to Britain. It's hard to argue that people aren't ready for self-rule when they're quoting your own philosophers at you. After World War II, Britain was tired, broke, its cities bombed, its economy strained. The Labour government elected in 1945 was more open to decolonization. Holding India by force would have required massive military commitment, and politically, it was becoming indefensible. So, independence was granted in 1947. But here's where the calm narration gets a little heavier. Partition. The subcontinent was divided into India and Pakistan. The decision, overseen by British officials under immense time pressure, carved through provinces and communities with startling speed. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, the man tasked with drawing the boundary, had never even been to India before. Because why not hand someone a ruler and a deadline? The result was one of the largest migrations in human history.
Millions moved across newly drawn borders. Communal violence erupted between Hindus and Muslims. Perhaps 1 million people died. Families were separated overnight. Villages transformed into front lines. Britain stepped away as the line hardened. It's one of the most enduring shadows of empire. Independence, yes, but also chaos born of hurried exit. Let's float gently west now, to Palestine. After World War I, Britain had controlled the territory under a League of Nations mandate. It had made promises, several actually, some to Arab leaders, some to Zionist leaders. These promises did not align particularly well. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities escalated through the 1920s and 30s. Violence increased. By the 1940s, Britain was caught in a conflict it struggled to contain. Exhausted and facing mounting insurgency, Britain handed the issue to the newly formed United Nations in 1947 and withdrew in 1948. The region descended into war almost immediately. Another imperial exit, another complicated legacy. Now let's ease into Africa again. Ghana became independent in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. It was a moment of celebration, symbolic, the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from Britain in the modern wave. And once the first domino fell, others followed. Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964. Each transition came with speeches about partnership and progress, but the economic structures left behind were still deeply tied to export of raw materials. Railways ran from mines to ports. Agricultural systems favored cash crops over local food security. Political borders, drawn in European conference rooms decades earlier, remained intact. Ethnic groups were bundled together within new nation-states that hadn't chosen those borders. Independence did not magically smooth those edges. And then there was Kenya's Mau Mau conflict in the 1950s. We touched on it before, but in the final accounting, it's impossible to ignore. During the uprising, British authorities detained tens of thousands of Kenyans in camps. Abuse, forced labor, harsh conditions. For years, official accounts minimized what happened. Documents were quietly stored, language carefully softened. It wasn't until decades later that survivors successfully sued the British government for compensation. History has a long memory, even when filing cabinets try to forget. Now let's gently cross to the Caribbean. Many Caribbean nations gained independence in the 1960s and 70s. Jamaica in 1962, Barbados in 1966. But the plantation economies, shaped for centuries around sugar and slavery, had left structural inequality. Wealth concentrated in certain families, land ownership patterns stubbornly uneven. And remember, when slavery was abolished in 1833, compensation flowed not to the enslaved, but to the enslavers. The financial aftershocks of that decision echoed for generations. Back in Britain, something else was happening: immigration. Citizens from former colonies began arriving in significant numbers after World War II. The Windrush docked in 1948, carrying Caribbean migrants invited to help rebuild Britain. They were technically citizens of the empire, but the welcome was complicated. Racial discrimination was common, housing barriers, employment bias, social hostility. The empire had relied on colonial labor and resources for centuries, but adjusting to diversity at home proved more uncomfortable. And so the imperial story folded inward. Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973. The imperial identity slowly gave way to a European one. Then later, of course, debates about sovereignty resurfaced in new forms. History loves recycling themes. Meanwhile, former colonies navigated their own post-colonial realities. Some thrived, some struggled, many experienced political instability shaped partly by colonial legacies, partly by Cold War interference, partly by internal divisions. Empire's fingerprints were everywhere, not always visible at first glance, but present. Even the Commonwealth, formed as a loose association of former colonies, carries that dual tone: cooperation, shared language, diplomatic ties, but also a reminder of the structure that once bound them together. Now, let's zoom out. The British Empire once controlled roughly a quarter of the world. Its navy ruled sea lanes. Its administrators wrote rules that governed millions. Its language spread across continents. And today, the empire as a political entity is gone. What remains are fragments: cultural influence, legal systems, railways, cricket matches, parliamentary procedures, English as a global lingua franca, and also unresolved conversations. Statues of imperial figures have been questioned, some removed, some defended. Debates swirl about how to teach empire in schools. Was it a force for modernization? For exploitation? For both? The honest answer is usually both, but that word can feel too tidy. Because modernization built on extraction carries a cost. Railways laid for resource transport don't erase famine. Universities established by empire don't cancel racial hierarchies embedded in law. Administrative efficiency does not soften displacement. And yet, many ordinary Britons in the 19th and early 20th centuries likely believed empire was benevolent. They read newspapers celebrating infrastructure projects. They attended exhibitions showcasing colonial goods. They saw maps painted red and felt pride. It's easy, in hindsight, to assign villainy, but often empire ran on ordinary people performing ordinary jobs within an extraordinary system. Clerks processing taxes, soldiers stationed abroad, teachers delivering British curriculum, merchants calculating profit margins. Not cartoon villains, just participants, which may be the most unsettling part. So, now as we settle into the final quiet minutes of this long imperial drift, imagine that once red map fading completely. Not with fireworks, not with a dramatic collapse, just with paperwork. Independence declarations signed, flags lowered, new flags raised, governors packing trunks, ships sailing home. An empire dissolving not in a single cataclysm, but in a series of reluctant acknowledgments that the world had moved on. The sun did eventually set, but not all at once, and the shadow